Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, you are stepping into a Europe that feels strangely wide and unusually still, a world just after the long shadow of the Black Death has begun to lift. We will not rush. We will walk slowly, as if our footsteps might echo too loudly in streets that have only recently learned what silence truly means. Before you settle in, if you find comfort in these calm wanderings through old lives and distant places, you are welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, you might share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. It is always a quiet joy to imagine how many different rooms, cities, and sleepless midnights gather here together. Now, you might dim the lights, perhaps let a fan hum softly in the background, and allow the day to loosen its grip on your shoulders. Tonight, we are not chasing kings or battles. We are listening for smaller things. The sound of a wooden door that has not opened in weeks. The faint creak of a sign above an empty shop. The soft whisper of wind crossing fields that once held more voices than grain. So, take a slow breath and let us step gently into the past where something unexpected is beginning to happen. A disaster has ended, and yet, in the quiet it left behind, a new world is slowly learning how to begin. You find yourself standing at the edge of a field that looks, at first glance, perfectly ordinary. The soil is dark, the rows are still visible, and a wooden fence leans where someone once repaired it with patient, practical hands. Yet something feels off, not frightening, just unfinished. Like a sentence that stopped in the middle and was never picked up again. There are no fresh footprints in the dirt, no distant voices calling across the land. Even the birds seem to speak more cautiously, as if the air itself remembers what has passed through here. This is Europe in the years just after the Great Plague has loosened its grip. The sickness has moved on, slowly, unevenly, leaving behind villages that are not destroyed, not burned, not broken, but simply quieter than they were meant to be. You walk a little farther, and the quiet grows heavier, though not in a cruel way. It is the kind of quiet that comes after a crowded room empties all at once. A wooden plow rests beside a shed, its handle smoothed by years of use. No one has taken it inside. No one has claimed it. It waits patiently for hands that may never return. Across much of Europe, this is the strange new reality. The plague did not just take lives. It took routines. It erased habits that had repeated for generations. Fields that once required many families to tend now stretch wider than the number of people left to care for them. There are, quite simply, too many fields and not enough hands. And that quiet imbalance begins to change everything. You notice how the land itself looks almost relieved, as if it has been given a long, unintended rest. Grass grows where wheat once stood. Paths soften without the steady rhythm of carts and boots. In some places, orchards continue to bear fruit, though no one arrives to gather it. Apples fall one by one into the grass, completing their quiet journey from branch to earth without applause. It is a gentle, almost tender kind of neglect. Historians, reading tax rolls and parish records from the time, would later notice the same pattern repeating across region after region. Entire households vanish from lists. Names that appeared every year simply stop, not replaced, not crossed out, just absent. And absence, you begin to realize, is not empty. It has weight. You pass a small cottage with its door slightly open. Inside, a wooden table still holds a bowl, a spoon resting where someone last set it down. Nothing dramatic, nothing shattered. Life here did not end in chaos. It simply paused and then never resumed. There is a quiet, almost awkward generosity to what remains. Land, tools, houses, all still here waiting for someone to claim them. For those who survived, this created a situation that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. A farmer who once struggled to hold a narrow strip of land might now find several plots with no owner. A laborer who once competed with dozens of others for a single day's work might now discover that the work is still there, but the workers are not. It is an unsettling kind of good fortune, the sort that arrives wearing borrowed clothes. You walk along the edge of 3 adjoining fields. None are marked. None are tended. In another time, each would have belonged to a different family, argued over, measured carefully, defended with stubborn pride. Now they lie open, like pages waiting for new writing. This is the first great shift after the plague. Not a new invention, not a grand speech, just a simple, practical truth. There is more land than people, and when something becomes scarce, its value changes. In this case, what has become scarce is not grain, not timber, not iron. It is you, your hands, your time, your ability to wake at dawn and finish a task before dusk. These ordinary things, once taken for granted, are now suddenly precious. There is a faint, almost ironic humor in this, the kind history sometimes offers with a straight face. For centuries, peasants had been told they were easily replaceable, that the world would continue quite comfortably without them. And then, quite unexpectedly, the world discovered it was not nearly as comfortable without them as it had assumed. You can almost imagine a lord standing beside a wide, empty field, realizing that authority, no matter how loudly declared, does not harvest wheat on its own. The wind moves through the tall grass with a soft, dry whisper, like pages turning in a book no one is currently reading. The land is still fertile, the seasons still arrive on schedule. The sun rises with its usual calm indifference. Nature, as always, keeps perfect time. It is human time that has stumbled. In many regions, surviving families begin to drift outward, not in panic, but in quiet curiosity. If there is empty land nearby, why not try it? If a neighboring village has fewer people than houses, why not move? Old boundaries, once guarded with tradition and obligation, begin to soften simply because there are too few people left to enforce them. You picture a farmer, perhaps someone named Tomas or Elin, walking past a field that was never theirs, pausing, looking around, and realizing that no one is there to object if they plant something in the spring. It is not rebellion. Not yet. It is something quieter than that. It is opportunity, arriving without announcement. In parish records and estate accounts, scholars later notice rents changing, agreements rewritten, expectations bending in small, practical ways. None of it feels dramatic in the moment. It feels like adjustment, like shifting your chair a little closer to the fire because the room has grown cold. But these small adjustments are the first cracks in a structure that once seemed unmovable. You stand for a moment at the center of the field, the sky wide above you, the earth steady beneath your boots. The world is not ending. It is reorganizing itself, slowly, awkwardly, like a town, waking after a long, uneasy sleep. And in this wide, quiet landscape, a subtle realization begins to take root. If there are too many fields and too few hands, then the hands at last begin to matter. Somewhere beyond the next village, a landowner is already wondering how to persuade workers to stay. Somewhere else, a laborer is discovering that being needed feels very different from being ordered. Power, which once moved in only one direction, is about to hesitate, turn, and drift another way. And as the wind brushes across the empty rows, carrying the faint scent of soil and last year's straw, you sense that this quiet imbalance will not remain quiet for long. Because when land waits, and people are suddenly rare, the value of a single ordinary life begins, very gently, to rise. You begin to notice it not in a grand announcement, not in a ringing declaration, but in the smallest, most ordinary moments, the kind that would have passed without comment only a few years earlier. A man pauses at a crossroads and does not hurry. A woman finishes binding a bundle of reeds and, instead of waiting for instructions, simply decides where she will go next. The change is quiet, almost shy, yet it hums beneath daily life like a low note that was never there before. For the first time in living memory, work is no longer something that simply happens to you. It is something you can, at least occasionally, choose. The fields still need tending, the animals still need feeding, and grain, as always, refuses to harvest itself out of politeness. Yet the balance has shifted in a way that feels both promising and slightly unsettling. There are too many tasks and too few people to complete them, and so the question that once echoed through every village, "Who will allow you to work?" begins to soften into a different, unfamiliar question. Who will persuade you to stay? You walk along a narrow lane between hedges that have grown a little wild without constant trimming. Ahead, a small manor house rises from the mist, its wooden beams dark with age. In another time, approaching this place would mean lowering your eyes, waiting to be told what must be done, how long it must be done, and for what little reward. Now, something is different. A steward stands near the gate, not with a list of orders, but with a tone that carries a hint, just a hint of invitation. The fields beyond the manor are wide, and the wheat that should be sown will not wait forever. The land is patient, yes, but not endlessly forgiving. Across much of Europe, surviving records quietly reveal the same pattern repeating again and again. Payments offered in coin instead of obligation. Promises of bread, ale, or better portions at harvest. Small gestures, practical and unceremonious, yet revolutionary in their own quiet way. Labor, once treated as an endless supply, has become a scarce and valuable resource. You can almost feel the shift in the air, like the moment before rain when the wind changes direction. A farmer who once competed with a dozen neighbors for a single day's work now finds that two different estates might both prefer his help. A builder who once accepted whatever was offered may now hear a second offer, slightly better, slightly warmer, perhaps including an extra measure of grain. It is not wealth, not yet, but it is leverage. And leverage, even in the smallest amount, has a way of changing how a person stands, how they speak, how long they pause before answering. There is a gentle, almost dry humor in how history handles this moment. For generations, many landowners had spoken as though workers were as plentiful as pebbles in a stream. Then, quite suddenly, the stream bed is visible, and every remaining pebble becomes surprisingly important. You imagine a lord glancing across his fields at dawn, counting not rows of wheat, but the number of people actually present. Authority still exists, of course. Titles do not vanish overnight. But authority without hands to carry out its wishes begins to feel less like command and more like hopeful suggestion. Along the road, you pass a group of laborers resting beside a low stone wall. Their tools lean nearby, handles worn smooth by years of grip. They are not idle, not careless, simply unhurried in a way that would once have been risky. One of them laughs softly at something you cannot quite hear, the sound carrying easily in the open air. Time, for them, has stretched just enough to allow a breath. In account books from the period, written in careful ink by patient scribes, numbers begin to shift. Wages rise, sometimes only a little, sometimes enough to cause quiet concern among those who must pay them. In certain towns, payments once given in leftovers or vague promises are replaced with actual coin, small and dull, yet undeniably real when it rests in your palm. Coin has weight, and weight, even a modest one, changes how choices feel. You can picture a builder, perhaps a man named Martin, with dust still clinging to his sleeves, standing between two offers. One estate needs a new roof before the rains arrive. Another wants a stone wall repaired before winter winds return. Neither can wait too long. For the first time, Martin is not simply waiting to be chosen. He is the one doing the choosing, quietly, thoughtfully, perhaps even enjoying the unfamiliar luxury of considering his options. It is not arrogance, it is adjustment. The world has tilted, just slightly, and everyone is still learning how to keep their balance. Of course, not everyone welcomes this shift. In manor halls and city chambers, there is a growing unease, a sense that something fundamental is slipping through careful fingers. If workers can move, if they can compare offers, if they can, most unsettling of all, decline, then the old order begins to feel less like a fixed ladder and more like a structure with loose joints. You might imagine the conversations held over evening fires, voices low, practical, concerned. How do you keep fields tended if those who tend them can simply leave? How do you maintain tradition if necessity keeps rewriting the rules? Outside, the seasons continue their steady rotation, indifferent to human worry. Spring arrives with its usual quiet insistence, nudging green shoots through soil that has waited long enough. The land is ready. It always is. The question is whether enough people will arrive to meet it. Along a village path, you notice a small but telling detail. A notice has been nailed to a wooden post, written in uneven letters. It is not a command. It is an offer. Work available. Payment promised. Meals included. An offer. The word itself would have sounded strange here only a decade earlier. There is a soft, almost playful irony in the situation. For years, many workers had been told that their place was fixed, their role predetermined, their future already measured out like grain in a sack. Now, without speeches or revolutions, reality has quietly disagreed. Scarcity has rewritten the conversation. You continue down the road as evening light settles into a warm, muted glow, the kind that softens rough edges and makes even tired buildings appear briefly dignified. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, fewer than there once were, but enough to remind you that life, stubborn and practical, continues. In one cottage doorway, a woman counts small coins into her palm, brow slightly furrowed, as if weighing not just their value, but what they might allow her to refuse next time. Nearby, a young boy watches, learning without being told that work is no longer only duty. It is slowly becoming negotiation. This is how power changes, not always with banners or shouted demands, but with quiet decisions repeated day after day. A pause before agreeing. A question asked where once there was silence. A step taken down a different road simply because it is, at last, available. You feel the evening air cool against your skin as the last light slips behind distant trees. Somewhere beyond the next hill, another estate is waiting, another field unplanted, another steward wondering how to convince the few remaining workers to stay through the season. And in that gentle uncertainty, a new and slightly unsettling truth begins to settle into the bones of this recovering world. If work can be chosen, then authority must learn how to persuade. Somewhere, even now, officials are beginning to write rules meant to hold the old order in place, to pin wages where they once were, to remind everyone how things used to function. But ink, as you will soon discover, is far less persuasive than hunger, opportunity, and the quiet knowledge of being needed. And as night gathers over the fields, carrying the soft scent of cut grass and cooling earth, you sense that the next attempt to control this new reality will arrive not with open hands, but with carefully written laws. By the time morning light spreads across the fields again, you begin to sense that the quiet shift you felt yesterday has not gone unnoticed. Change, even when it moves softly, has a way of disturbing those who once relied on the world staying exactly as it was. And somewhere beyond the hedgerows and parish lanes, men with careful handwriting and worried brows have already begun preparing their response. You find yourself approaching a small market square, where the air still carries the faint scent of damp wood and yesterday's ashes. A few villagers gather near a post at the center, their movements unhurried but attentive. There is no festival, no announcement of a wedding or harvest. Instead, a sheet of parchment has been nailed into place, its edges curling slightly in the morning chill. The ink is still dark, fresh. A clerk stands nearby, clearing his throat with the quiet importance of someone who knows the words he is about to read were not written by chance. His voice is steady, practiced, the sort of tone meant to sound final even when the world outside refuses to cooperate. The message, once spoken aloud, is simple in intention, though heavy in implication. Wages are to remain as they were before the Great Sickness. Workers are expected to accept the same payments they once did. Those who refuse may face penalties. It is, in essence, an attempt to hold the past in place. You listen as the words settle over the square like a thin layer of frost. No one protests loudly. No one laughs. The villagers simply stand, absorbing the meaning in their own quiet ways. A man shifts his weight from one foot to the other. A woman adjusts the basket at her hip. A boy watches the clerk's lips more than the parchment, as if trying to decide whether spoken authority feels different from written authority. Across England and other parts of Europe, similar proclamations begin appearing, each one crafted with careful seriousness. Historians would later call them measures to control wages, but here, in this small square, they feel less like economic policy and more like a polite insistence that yesterday's world should kindly return. There is a gentle, almost wry humor hidden in the effort. It is as if someone has noticed the tide going out and decided that the best solution is to issue an official request for the sea to come back immediately. You walk past the notice and notice the details that the ink cannot control. The fields still wait. The barns still echo with emptier space than before. The number of workers has not magically increased simply because a rule has been written. Reality, inconveniently, continues. In manor halls, conversations grow more careful. Landowners, once accustomed to command, now find themselves negotiating through layers of expectation and worry. If wages rise too high, their income shrinks. If workers leave, crops fail. Authority remains, but it has acquired a new companion: dependence. You can almost picture a lord seated at a long wooden table, fingers resting on polished grain, listening as a steward explains that several laborers have already moved to a neighboring estate, offering better terms. The lord's expression may remain composed, yet somewhere behind that calm sits a quiet realization that titles do not harvest wheat and pride does not mend fences. The laws, however, continue to multiply. Written decrees, copied by patient scribes, travel from town to town. Each copy carries the same intention: to anchor wages, to prevent workers from drifting toward higher pay, to restore a familiar balance that once required no explanation. In one dimly lit room, you notice a scribe bent over a desk, the air thick with the faint, dusty scent of ink and scraped parchment. His hand moves steadily, line after line, repeating the same phrases with practiced precision. He is not cruel, not particularly invested in the outcome. He is simply doing what scribes have always done, preserving words so they can travel farther than voices. Yet even he pauses, just for a moment, when he hears laughter drifting through the open window. Outside, two laborers compare offers from different estates, their tone casual, almost amused. Not rebellious, not defiant, just practical. The kind of quiet practicality that is far harder to punish than open resistance. The scribe dips his quill again, perhaps aware that ink can describe reality, but it cannot replace it. As these wage laws spread, enforcement becomes an oddly delicate dance. Officials attempt to fine those who demand higher pay, but tracking every agreement across scattered villages proves more difficult than expected. People make arrangements privately. Payments shift from coin to goods, from recorded contracts to spoken promises. The old structure tries to tighten its grip, yet everyday life slips gently between its fingers. There is something almost theatrical in the contrast. On parchment, the world appears orderly, fixed, obedient. On the ground, it remains fluid, negotiated, alive. You wander past another notice, this one older, its edges softened by rain. The ink has faded slightly, yet the intent is still visible. Hold wages steady, maintain tradition, preserve the familiar order. And yet, just beyond the post, a farmer discusses a higher payment for harvest work with a neighboring steward, their voices low but unmistakably firm. The law says one thing, the soil says another. You begin to understand that power is not disappearing. It is learning, reluctantly, that it must adapt. Authority that once relied on unquestioned obedience now finds itself competing with necessity. If a field remains unharvested because workers have gone elsewhere, the loss is immediate and tangible, far more persuasive than any distant penalty. Even those who support the laws sense the strain. In council rooms and manor chambers, discussions grow longer, more cautious. How do you preserve stability without pushing workers away entirely? How do you demand loyalty when survival itself has become negotiable? Outside, the seasons continue their patient cycle, indifferent to legal language. Early shoots appear, green and determined, pushing through soil that has rested too long. The land is ready to produce again, but readiness alone is not enough. It still requires hands, backs, time. You pass a group of villagers gathered near a well, their conversation drifting between weather, repairs, and rumors of new rules. One man shrugs, not dismissively, but thoughtfully, as if weighing whether a written decree truly outweighs the promise of better bread for his family. It is in these small pauses that history quietly shifts direction. The attempt to freeze wages, to hold time still, reveals something unexpected. The old order is not as solid as it once appeared. It can still speak, still command, still threaten, but it can no longer assume automatic obedience. And that realization, more than any single law, begins to loosen the foundations beneath it. As evening settles, the market square empties, leaving the notice fluttering softly against the post. The parchment remains, patient, certain of its authority. Yet around it, life continues in its own practical rhythm. Agreements made quietly, choices weighed carefully, opportunities considered with cautious hope. You pause for a moment, listening to the faint creak of the wooden post in the cooling air, and it becomes clear that something subtle but irreversible has begun. Rules written in ink may try to preserve yesterday, but tomorrow is already negotiating its own terms. Somewhere beyond the next cluster of villages, frustration is beginning to gather. Not loud, not yet dangerous, but present. Like distant thunder you feel more than hear. Because when people discover they are needed, and then are told to forget it, patience rarely holds forever. And as the last light fades, you sense that the next change will not arrive as a quiet adjustment or a carefully worded decree, but as a moment when obedience itself begins, gently at first, to crack. You begin to notice it not in the roar of armies or the proclamations of kings, but in the softer places where history usually whispers. In the corners of workshops, in the murmured negotiations at market stalls, in the way a mason pauses, wipes dust from his hands, and, just for a moment, does not bow quite as low as his grandfather once did. The world after the great dying is not only emptier, it is, in a strange and uneasy way, more negotiable. You walk through a town that has survived, barely, and what strikes you first is the silence between buildings. Houses stand with shutters hanging loose, their owners long gone. A field just beyond the walls lies half wild, grass reclaiming the neat lines once scratched into the soil. And yet, amid this quiet, you hear something new. Bargaining. Not the quiet, resigned kind. Real bargaining. A farmer refuses a low offer. A mason names his price. A woman who spins wool does not accept the first coin placed in her palm. These moments would have seemed almost improper a generation earlier. Before the plague, most people did not negotiate their place in the world. It had been assigned at birth, like a coat you were expected to wear until it wore you out. But now, the coat hangs looser. You drift closer to a group gathered near the town well. Their conversation is not about kings or crusades or distant wars. It is about wages, about who is hiring, about which lord across the river is rumored to be offering better terms to anyone willing to relocate. Relocate. The word itself feels rebellious. Before, movement was limited, controlled, sometimes forbidden. People belonged to land the way trees did. Now, with so many fields empty and so many workshops short of hands, the balance has shifted, just slightly, but enough to be felt like a change in the wind. You sense it in posture, in tone, in the small but meaningful decision to say no. This is how new voices enter history, not with trumpets, but with hesitation that slowly becomes confidence. The authorities, of course, are not blind to this change. Somewhere, in a drafty hall, men with ink-stained fingers attempt to pin reality back into place with official words. Laws are written to freeze wages where they were before the plague, as if time itself could be ordered to behave. Decrees insist that workers must accept old pay, old duties, old expectations. But paper is patient. Hunger is not. You can almost hear the quiet frustration of those who read, or are read, these proclamations. The law may say one thing, the empty fields say another. When a lord needs grain planted before the season turns, principle begins to soften. Pride bends. Exceptions are made. Quietly, of course. Always quietly. You watch as a steward speaks to a group of laborers. His voice carries authority, but it is threaded with something unfamiliar. Persuasion. He offers small incentives, a little more grain, a promise of lighter duties through winter. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the chronicles, but enough to reveal the truth. Power, once absolute, is learning to negotiate. There is something almost ironic in this. The plague, a force of pure chaos, has begun to produce subtle forms of choice. You wander into a workshop where a young apprentice works beside an older craftsman. The master's hands are steady, practiced, shaped by decades of repetition. The apprentice, however, asks questions, not timidly, curiously. Why this tool? Why this method? Could it be done faster? In another era, such questions might have been dismissed as impertinent. Now, with fewer skilled workers available, curiosity becomes valuable. Innovation, once a luxury, begins to feel like necessity. It is here, in these small exchanges, that you sense the earliest tremors of a broader shift. Not a revolution, nothing so loud, but a slow rearranging of how people see themselves, not merely as subjects, but as participants. You step back, into the street, and notice clothing, subtle changes. A merchant's wife wears fabric that would once have been reserved for higher ranks. A prosperous blacksmith owns a belt decorated with metalwork more ornate than tradition might approve of. These are not acts of defiance shouted from rooftops. They are quiet experiments in identity. Who decides what you are allowed to be? Before the plague, the answer had been simple, rigid, unquestioned. Now the answer is negotiable, uneven, sometimes contradictory, but undeniably shifting. You pass a small gathering near the church steps. The priest speaks of order, of divine hierarchy, of the importance of knowing one's place. His voice is calm, practiced, reassuring. And yet, as you listen, you sense that the words land differently than they once did. Not rejected, no, not openly, but weighed, measured. People who have watched entire families vanish in a single season do not hear certainty in quite the same way. Faith remains, but it carries new questions folded quietly inside it, like letters tucked into a sleeve. You feel the mood of the town as something layered. Grief still lingers, heavy and familiar. Fear has not fully left, but beneath both, there is a thin, persistent thread of possibility. It is not joyous. It is not triumphant. It is cautious. As evening settles, smoke curls from chimneys that still function, and you realize that survival itself has become a kind of authority. Those who remain, farmers, craftsmen, widows, apprentices, carry an unspoken knowledge. The world did not end, even when it seemed determined to. And if the world did not end, perhaps it can change. You sit for a moment on a low stone wall, listening to the distant sounds of work winding down. A cart creaks. Someone laughs, briefly, almost guiltily, as if joy must still ask permission. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke, ordinary and strangely comforting. History at this point does not feel like a grand narrative. It feels like a series of small permissions being quietly granted. You may ask for more. You may move. You may question. None of these are guaranteed. None are evenly distributed. Many will be resisted, rolled back, argued against. but the seed has been planted in the most unlikely soil, aftermath. And seeds, as you know, do not need permission to grow. As darkness deepens, the town settles into uneasy rest. Tomorrow will bring the same negotiations, the same cautious experiments, the same gentle testing of boundaries that once seemed immovable. No one here would describe themselves as part of a transformation. They are simply trying to live. Yet you, standing just outside their moment, can sense it clearly. The quiet rise of new voices has begun, not with rebellion, but with the simple, radical act of realizing that the future is not entirely predetermined. And once that idea exists, even in a whisper, it is very difficult to silence. You begin to sense the tension before you can name it. It lingers in the spaces where conversations stop just a little too quickly when someone important walks by. It hides in the polite smiles that do not quite reach the eyes. It lives in the careful way people choose their words, as if language itself has become a narrow bridge suspended over something deep and uncertain. The world has survived the great dying, yes, but survival has rearranged the balance of who depends on whom. You find yourself walking along a road that leads toward a manor house, its stone walls still impressive, still meant to suggest permanence. From a distance, it appears unchanged, a symbol of authority that has stood for generations. Yet as you draw closer, small details begin to reveal the strain beneath the surface. The outer fields are thinner than they should be. Sections lie unworked, grass creeping back where wheat once grew in orderly rows. A barn door hangs slightly askew. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, just enough to suggest that control here is no longer effortless. Inside, the lord of the estate, who once commanded labor as naturally as breathing, now faces a quieter, more stubborn reality. There are simply fewer people. You can almost imagine the ledgers spread across a heavy wooden table. Columns that once balanced neatly now show uncomfortable gaps. Land without hands produces nothing but weeds. And weeds, as it turns out, pay very little in rent. So the old expectations begin to bend. At first, only slightly. A small concession here, a temporary allowance there. Perhaps a promise of reduced duties through winter, framed as generosity rather than necessity. Pride prefers soft language. But outside the manor walls, something else is happening. You drift back toward the town, where the market square hums with a low, steady energy. Here, survival has turned into opportunity for a small but growing group. Merchants, traders, skilled, craftsmen, people whose wealth does not come from inherited land, but from movement, exchange, and timing. Coin, unlike soil, can travel. You watch a cloth merchant unfold a bolt of fabric that catches the light in a way that would have been rare not long ago. The material is fine, dyed in a shade that suggests access to distant trade routes. He speaks with confidence, not arrogance exactly, but with the easy assurance of someone who knows his goods are desired. Across from him, a minor noble examines the cloth with careful neutrality. The noble's ring is still heavy, his posture still trained by generations of expectation. Yet there is hesitation in his bargaining. He needs what is being offered, and needing changes everything. This is where the tension begins to sharpen, not into open conflict, but into something quieter and more persistent. Old power was built on land, titles, and the assumption that hierarchy was part of the natural order, as fixed as the turning of the seasons. New wealth, however, moves along roads, across rivers, through contracts spoken in crowded rooms rather than declared from stone balconies. One is inherited, the other is earned, traded, accumulated one careful decision at a time. You can almost feel the discomfort this creates. In the past, a noble might have viewed a merchant as useful but clearly beneath notice, a necessary part of the machinery of daily life. Now, that same merchant might possess ready coin, while the noble possesses acres that cannot be fully worked. Status remains, but liquidity, that quiet ability to act quickly, has begun to shift elsewhere. It is a strange inversion, not complete, not immediate, but undeniable. You wander into a counting room where a trader and a landholder sit across from one another, parchment between them. The conversation is courteous, even warm, yet every sentence carries careful calculation. Terms are discussed, percentages of harvest, rites of passage, guarantees of supply before winter. Once, such discussions would have been dictated from above. Now they are negotiated. Negotiation is slower, messier, but it reveals something profound. Authority is no longer a one-way current. You notice, too, how appearance begins to blur. A prosperous guild member dresses in fabrics once associated with higher rank. A lesser noble, pressed by shrinking income, chooses simpler clothing than his ancestors might have tolerated. No proclamation announces these changes. They simply appear quietly, like moss spreading across stone. And people notice. They may not speak of it openly. Etiquette still matters, pride still guards its territory. But the human eye is very good at measuring symbols. Who rides a well-fed horse? Who carries polished tools? Who pays in coin without counting twice? These details accumulate into a new, unspoken awareness. Wealth is no longer tied only to birth. You pause near a tavern as evening gathers, and inside, you hear a mix of voices that might once have occupied very different worlds. A craftsman laughs at a joke told by a trader. A minor official listens more than he speaks. Somewhere in the corner, a man with the bearing of old status drinks more quietly than he might have years before. No one here would describe this as a revolution. There are no banners, no dramatic speeches, no sudden overturning of order. Instead, it feels like a slow negotiation between memory and necessity. Memory insists that the old hierarchy is natural, proper, ordained. Necessity replies, gently but firmly, that empty fields and unpaid rents are very persuasive arguments. You step back into the cool night air and look toward the manor again, its silhouette dark against the sky. It still stands. It will continue to stand. The old structures are not collapsing overnight. Stone rarely does. But inside those walls, decisions are being made that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. Agreements with townspeople, reliance on hired labor, even, in some places, the quiet selling of privileges once guarded fiercely. Power is not vanishing. It is adapting. And adaptation, as history often shows, is both survival and transformation wrapped together. You walk along the road where carts have left shallow grooves in the earth, traces of goods moving from field to market, from workshop to distant towns. Each journey represents a small thread in a growing web of exchange. The web is still fragile, still uneven, but it is spreading. With every transaction, with every negotiated contract, with every moment someone chooses coin over command, the balance shifts another fraction. No thunder announces it. No chronicler pauses to underline the exact day the change became irreversible. Instead, it happens the way dawn arrives, so gradually that those within it hardly notice until the light is already everywhere. You realize, standing in this in-between world, that the aftermath of catastrophe has created something paradoxical. The plague reduced the population, shattered families, and scarred entire regions. Yet, from that devastation, new pathways have opened. Narrow at first, uncertain, sometimes resisted, but real. Old nobility still carries weight. Titles still command respect. Tradition still shapes behavior. But now, beside lineage, there is leverage. Beside inheritance, there is initiative. And between them stretches a quiet, persistent tension that will not resolve quickly, because both sides are, in their own ways, necessary to the world that is trying, slowly, cautiously, to rebuild itself. As the night deepens and the last voices fade from the tavern, you sense that this delicate balance between old power and new coin will define the rhythm of the years ahead. Not as a dramatic clash, but as a long, patient negotiation written in contracts, customs, and the subtle language of who truly has the ability to say yes or no. And in that ability, soft as it may seem, lies the beginning of a very different kind of future. You begin to notice that the change in this recovering world does not arrive with banners or shouting crowds, but with something far quieter, almost polite, and therefore far more unsettling to those who once relied on certainty. It appears in the way people speak about work, about time, about what a day of labor is worth, as if the very meaning of effort has been gently renegotiated while no one was looking too closely. Morning settles over a village that still carries the faint scars of loss. Yet the air now holds a steadier rhythm, the kind that comes when routines return, even if they return altered. Smoke rises from low chimneys in thin, patient threads, and somewhere a wooden wheel complains softly as it turns, drawing water from a well that has seen too many quiet years. You walk along the edge of a field where a handful of workers gather, fewer than the land clearly requires, and the absence itself feels like a presence, a silent reminder that labor has become something rare, enough to matter. Before the Great Dying, work was often an obligation that flowed downward from authority, like rain from a heavy sky, unquestioned and expected, because there were always more hands than tasks. Now, however, each pair of hands carries a new kind of gravity, and you can sense it in the posture of the people standing here, in the unhurried way they listen before agreeing to anything, as though time itself has gained weight. A land steward, wrapped in a cloak that once signaled easy command, speaks with careful courtesy, offering terms that would have sounded surprisingly generous only a generation earlier. There is mention of coin rather than only duty, of reduced days owed to the manor, of small allowances that are presented as kindness but clearly shaped by necessity. Pride, once rigid as iron, has learned the softer language of persuasion. You watch one worker, a broad-shouldered man with soil permanently settled into the lines of his palms, consider the offer without immediately nodding. That pause, small as it is, carries more meaning than any speech. In another time, hesitation might have been seen as insolence. Now it is negotiation, and negotiation, once introduced, rarely leaves. Across parts of Europe, rulers and landholders have already tried to slow this shift with words written into law, attempting to freeze wages at older levels, as if history might politely agree to stand still. In England, for instance, proclamations were issued to prevent laborers from asking for higher pay, insisting that the old rates remain proper and sufficient. On parchment, the command appears firm, almost reassuring in its clarity. In practice, however, reality proves less obedient. You can imagine the scene in a distant field where a farmer, desperate to bring in a harvest before weather turns, quietly agrees to pay more than the law prefers, because grain rotting in the ground serves no one, least of all pride. Survival, as it turns out, is a persuasive negotiator, and it rarely bothers to consult official documents before making decisions. There is a gentle, almost wry truth here that people begin to understand. A rule can be written in ink, but hunger is written in the body, and the body tends to win the argument. By midday, you drift toward a small town where the market square holds a different kind of energy than it did in earlier generations. Not louder exactly, but more self-aware, as though everyone senses that each exchange now carries a subtle question beneath it. What is this truly worth, and who gets to decide? A scribe sits at a narrow table near the edge of the square, copying agreements for those who cannot write, his reed pen moving with patient precision while the smell of ink mingles with the warm, slightly sour scent of packed earth and wool. Contracts, once reserved mostly for larger matters of land and inheritance, now appear in more ordinary exchanges, shaping relationships that used to rely on habit and assumption. Words are becoming tools, and tools, once picked up, tend to change the shape of the hands that use them. You notice how people listen differently when terms are spoken aloud, how they ask for clarification, how they repeat phrases to ensure nothing slips past unnoticed. Language in this moment is not decoration, it is protection. Somewhere nearby, a woman soothes a restless child while waiting for her husband to finish negotiating a short-term hire for the coming weeks, her voice low and rhythmic, a soft counterpoint to the careful bargaining unfolding a few steps away. Life continues in its ordinary tenderness, even as the structure beneath it quietly rearranges. There is, of course, resistance, not loud, dramatic resistance, but a steady discomfort among those who feel the ground shifting under traditions that once felt eternal. Sermons remind listeners of proper order. Officials repeat old expectations with renewed emphasis. The past is invoked like a familiar song, comforting, authoritative, meant to steady uncertain hearts. Yet outside the walls of churches and halls, reality keeps whispering its own message. If labor is scarce, it becomes valuable. If it is valuable, it can be chosen. And if it can be chosen, then obedience is no longer automatic. It is negotiated, shaped, sometimes even refused. You pass a group of workers sharing coarse bread in the shade of a cart, their conversation relaxed, even lightly humorous, as one of them jokes that for the first time in his life, he has been asked, politely, whether he would return tomorrow. The laughter is not cruel. It carries a quiet amazement, the kind that comes when a long familiar burden suddenly feels lighter. It is a small moment, almost forgettable. And yet it would have been nearly unthinkable not long ago. As afternoon leans toward evening, you sense that this shift is not simply about wages or contracts, but about something more delicate and profound. The slow recognition that ordinary people possess leverage, a word no one here would use, yet everyone is beginning to understand in practice. Leverage does not shout. It rests in the ability to wait, to say gently, not yet, to choose one offer over another. These are quiet powers, easy to overlook, but once discovered, they rarely disappear entirely, even when later generations try to press them back into silence. You pause near a church door where a notice has been pinned, its lettering formal, reminding parishioners of their duties and expected conduct. The message is clear, confident, rooted in tradition. And still, you sense that outside these words, life is already negotiating new terms in fields, workshops, and narrow streets. Authority remains, faith remains, custom remains. But alongside them now stands something newer, less visible, and perhaps more enduring. The idea that work has value not only because it is required, but because it is offered. As dusk settles, the village grows quieter. the day folding itself into softer sounds. A distant animal shifting in its pen, the muted clink of tools being set aside, the low murmur of evening prayers. In this calm, it becomes easier to feel how profound the change truly is, not because it arrives with spectacle, but because it reshapes daily life in 1,000 small decisions. No single moment announces that the old order has ended. Instead, the world simply begins to operate differently. And once people grow accustomed to being asked rather than commanded, to being paid rather than merely obligated, to hearing their own voices included, however modestly, in decisions that shape their survival, it becomes very difficult to return entirely to silence. You realize, standing in the fading light, that this is a kind of quiet rebellion, one conducted not with weapons, but with patience, necessity, and the slow, steady insistence of lived reality. It is not loud enough to frighten, not sudden enough to be easily stopped, but it is persistent. And persistence, more than spectacle, is often what history remembers long after the noise has faded. As the last glow of day slips behind the fields, you are left with a gentle, lingering question, one that seems to hover in the cooling air like the final note of a distant bell. If people have learned that their time and labor carry weight, how long will it be before they begin to wonder what else might also be negotiable? You begin to notice that after so much noise, after the bells that once tolled too often, after the hurried prayers whispered over hurried graves, what remains is not only grief, but something quieter, stranger, almost like a long breath the world did not realize it was holding. It is a calm, but not the peaceful kind people speak of in poetry. This calm feels thinner, more watchful, as if everyone is listening for a sound that might return. You walk along a narrow path that leads toward a small church standing at the center of a village that has learned, in ways it never wished to, how fragile routine can be. The building itself is unchanged, its stones still cool to the touch, its wooden door worn smooth by generations of hands, yet the space around it feels different, as though absence has become part of the landscape. Before the great dying, faith here followed a rhythm as predictable as sunrise. People attended Mass because it was what one did, because parents had done it, and their parents before them, because belief was woven into the structure of ordinary life so tightly that questioning it would have felt like questioning gravity. Now, however, belief carries a new weight because it has been forced to answer questions no one ever wanted to ask aloud. Inside, the air holds the familiar scent of wax and faint incense, but you sense how the congregation sits differently than it might have in earlier years. Shoulders slightly drawn inward, eyes lingering longer on the crucifix, as if searching for reassurance that suffering still has meaning. The priest's voice is steady, practiced, offering words about endurance, about divine will, about the promise that pain is never without purpose. And yet, beneath those words, there is another current. You can feel it in the silence between sentences. Because after witnessing entire families vanish within weeks, after watching prayers spoken with perfect devotion fail to halt the spread of death, people have begun to carry a question that does not shout but refuses to leave. If faith was meant to protect, why did it not? This is not disbelief, not exactly. It is something softer and more complicated, a quiet rearranging of certainty. Outside the church, you notice small changes that might escape a hurried observer. A charm tied discreetly to a doorway, a sprig of herbs hung above a window, marks scratched into wood, half prayer, half protection. These gestures are not officially encouraged, Yet they persist, because when fear grows large enough, people reach for every thread that might hold. It is a gentle paradox. In many places, devotion becomes more intense, not less. Processions grow longer. Candles burn in greater numbers. Voices rise higher during hymns, as if volume itself might bridge the distance between earth and heaven. The need for comfort does not fade after catastrophe, it deepens. And yet, at the very same time, another change unfolds quietly beneath the surface. You overhear a conversation near a well, where two villagers speak in low tones, not mocking faith, but wondering, carefully, respectfully, whether some things might simply happen without divine intention, whether illness could move through the world like weather, indifferent to virtue. The idea is spoken almost apologetically, as though the words themselves might offend the air. It is not rebellion, it is curiosity. And curiosity, once awakened, has a way of lingering long after fear has settled. By midday, you find yourself near a small shrine at the edge of a road, its paint faded, its offerings modest, bread, a few dried flowers, a ribbon that has seen too many seasons. Travelers pause here, touching the surface lightly, whispering brief requests for safe passage, their gestures quick but sincere. Ritual continues, because ritual provides structure, and structure feels like safety when memory still carries the echo of chaos. You begin to sense that people are not choosing between faith and doubt as if they were opposite shores. Instead, they are holding both at once, like two fragile vessels balanced carefully in the same hands. Inside homes, evening prayers are still spoken, children still taught familiar words, yet alongside these traditions appear small, practical habits shaped by recent memory. Extra care with cleanliness, cautious distance from those who show signs of illness, a heightened awareness of how quickly life can tilt without warning. Spiritual comfort and earthly caution begin to coexist, not as rivals, but as companions. It is a quieter kind of wisdom, born not from books, but from survival. As dusk approaches, you sit near the doorway of a modest house where a mother hums softly while trimming the wick of a small oil lamp, her child already drifting towards sleep beside her. The melody is simple, almost repetitive, yet it carries a tenderness that feels stronger than any sermon. In moments like this, faith is less about grand declarations and more about the steady reassurance that tomorrow is still worth preparing for. You realize that after mass death, belief often shifts from certainty to trust, not the loud, triumphant kind, but a softer trust that allows room for unanswered questions. There is, too, a subtle change in how people think about death itself. Before, it may have felt distant, an event reserved for old age or misfortune. Now it has been seen up close, too often, too suddenly, and familiarity has replaced abstraction. Gravestones are visited more frequently, names are spoken more gently. There is less illusion about permanence. Strangely, this does not always lead to despair. In many cases, it creates a calmer acceptance, as though, once the worst has been witnessed, smaller fears lose some of their power. The world, having shown its harshest face, can no longer surprise in quite the same way. You walk past the church again as night settles fully, and this time, the silence feels different, not empty, but layered, holding prayers, doubts, memories, and hopes all at once. The bell does not ring tonight, yet you almost imagine you can hear its echo lingering in the stones. This is the strange calm that follows catastrophe, not a return to innocence, but a quieter, more complicated peace built from people who now understand how fragile everything truly is. Faith remains. Fear remains. But between them grows something new, a reflective stillness, a willingness to live with questions rather than demand immediate answers. And perhaps that is why the night feels gentler than you expected. Because when certainty breaks, it sometimes leaves behind a space where humility can settle, where belief becomes less about control and more about companionship, an unseen presence walking beside ordinary lives rather than directing them from afar. As you stand beneath a sky scattered with patient stars, you sense that this inner shift, this blending of devotion, doubt, ritual, and quiet resilience, will shape not only how people pray, but how they think, how they learn, and eventually, how they begin to look at the world with eyes that are both more cautious and more curious than any generation before. And in that slow, thoughtful gaze lies the seed of something history will later recognize as a turning, not loud, not immediate, but profound enough that even centuries from now, echoes of this strange calm will still be felt in the way people search for meaning after loss. You begin to notice that after fear loosens its grip, even slightly, something else begins to grow in the space it leaves behind, not loudly and not all at once, but like a faint glow under ash that refuses to go out. It is not rebellion, not yet, and certainly not confidence, but a quieter impulse that feels almost unfamiliar at first, the simple, persistent urge to understand. You walk through a town that has learned how quickly certainty can collapse. And because of that memory, people now observe the world with a different kind of attention, one that lingers a little longer on causes, on patterns, on the small details that once passed unnoticed. Survival has a strange side effect. Once you have seen that life can change without warning, you begin to wonder whether other things that once felt permanent might also be questioned. The morning air carries the soft rasp of a quill somewhere nearby, and you follow the sound to a narrow room where a scribe sits beside a window, his table crowded with parchment, ink, and the careful order of copied lines. His work is not new. Scribes have existed for centuries, but the feeling around the act of writing seems subtly altered. The words he traces are no longer only prayers or royal decrees. Some are practical records, observations, fragments of knowledge gathered because someone, somewhere, decided that remembering details might help avoid future disaster. Ink, in this moment, becomes a quiet form of insurance. You notice how he pauses occasionally, not merely copying, but reading, as if weighing the meaning of what he writes. And that pause, small, almost invisible, suggests something deeper than routine. Once, knowledge was often treated as something received, preserved, passed down unchanged. Now, for some, it is beginning to feel like something that can be examined. Outside, the town continues its ordinary rhythm, carts creaking, voices low, trade steady. Yet beneath that surface, you sense a subtle shift in how people explain the world to themselves. When illness once spread, many accepted it as punishment or fate without question, because questioning felt dangerous, even disrespectful. Now, after witnessing how widely and unpredictably death moved, a few careful minds begin to ask whether patterns might exist beneath what once seemed purely divine will. The question is not shouted, it is whispered. And whispers, when shared carefully, can travel surprisingly far. You pass a small gathering near a workshop where a young apprentice listens as an older craftsman explains why certain metals behave differently under heat, his words grounded in experience rather than doctrine, shaped by observation rather than authority. The lesson is practical, meant to improve tools, yet it carries a quiet, philosophical weight. Knowledge here is earned through testing, through watching what happens rather than assuming what must be. This is how curiosity often returns to a wounded world, not through grand theories, but through hands-on questions about how things actually work. By midday, you find yourself near a modest collection of books kept within a religious house, their covers worn, their pages handled with a mixture of reverence and caution. Access to such texts is still limited, still guarded, because knowledge has long been treated as something powerful enough to require supervision. And perhaps it is. You notice how one reader turns pages slowly, lips moving faintly as he follows the lines, not only absorbing what is written, but lingering over passages that hint at explanations of nature, of medicine, of the structure of the heavens. These are not necessarily forbidden ideas, yet they exist in a delicate space, acceptable as long as they do not challenge the deeper framework of authority. And yet, once a mind begins to compare explanations, it becomes difficult to stop. You sense the tension here, not harsh, but present, like a thread pulled just tight enough to be felt. Institutions that once provided certainty still do so, offering stability, order, meaning. But alongside that stability grows a quieter awareness that understanding the world might require more than simply repeating inherited answers. It is not defiance, it is inquiry. And inquiry, unlike rebellion, often appears harmless at first, even helpful, because it promises practical benefits, better harvests, improved remedies, more reliable tools. No one objects to knowledge that makes life easier. The subtle shift happens when the same habit of asking how begins to drift toward asking why. You walk through a shaded corridor where faded murals depict stories of saints and miracles, their colors softened by time. And you notice how viewers still admire them, still find comfort in their familiar symbolism. Yet you also sense that some now see these images not only as sacred history, but as representations, stories meant to guide, to teach, perhaps even to be interpreted. Interpretation is a quiet doorway. Once opened, it rarely closes completely. In the late afternoon, you sit near a window where light falls across a table scattered with small objects. A compass used by travelers, a measuring cord, a scrap of parchment covered in rough calculations, written out in careful words rather than symbols, so they can be spoken aloud clearly. These tools are humble, practical, yet they reveal a growing desire to map, to measure, to predict. If the world can be measured, perhaps it can also be understood. If it can be understood, perhaps it is not governed solely by mystery. This thought does not erase faith. Instead, it changes the relationship people have with uncertainty. Where once mystery demanded only acceptance, now it sometimes invites investigation. You overhear two men speaking quietly about a recent illness, discussing not only prayer, but also whether certain living conditions might have worsened its spread, whether air, water, or proximity played a role. Their tone is cautious, respectful, yet undeniably analytical. They are not rejecting divine meaning. They are adding another layer of explanation beside it. It is a small intellectual step, but history often turns on small steps repeated many times. As evening approaches, the town settles into a softer rhythm, and you realize that what is emerging here is not a sudden awakening, but a gradual rebalancing between authority and observation. Institutions still guide, traditions still hold communities together, yet individuals begin to trust their own experiences just a little more than before. Experience becomes evidence, and evidence, once valued, begins to shape decisions. You pass the scribe again, now working by lamplight, the faint smoke curling upward as his pen moves steadily across the page. He copies a text that preserves older knowledge, yet in the margins you notice small notes, clarifications, corrections, questions. They are modest, respectful, but they exist. A margin note is a quiet act of independence. It does not overthrow the main text. It simply suggests that the reader is no longer entirely passive. Night deepens, and with it comes a gentle stillness that feels less fragile than the silence that followed the worst days of loss. This calm carries thought within it, a slow turning of ideas like stones in a patient stream. People still fear what they cannot control, still pray for protection, still honor the structures that have held society together. Yet alongside those instincts grows a new habit, the willingness to ask carefully whether understanding might offer another kind of safety. You look up at the sky where stars hold their steady positions, and you sense how generations before accepted their movement as fixed symbols of destiny. Now, in a few quiet rooms scattered across towns and monasteries, individuals begin to wonder whether those lights follow patterns that can be traced, predicted, perhaps even explained. It is not arrogance. It is curiosity shaped by survival. Because when catastrophe has already proven that ignorance offers no shield, the search for knowledge begins to feel less like a risk and more like a necessity. As the final lamps dim and the town settles into sleep, you realize that these first sparks of questioning are small enough to be overlooked by anyone expecting dramatic change. There are no proclamations, no declarations of a new age. Only marginal notes, careful observations, practical experiments, and the growing sense that truth might be something discovered as well as inherited. And once people learn that asking why does not immediately bring disaster, the question itself becomes less frightening, more familiar, almost comforting in its quiet promise that the world, however unpredictable, might still be something the human mind can slowly, patiently begin to understand. You begin to notice it first, not as noise, but as rhythm. After years when streets felt too wide for the number of footsteps that crossed them, the towns and cities of this recovering world begin, slowly and almost cautiously, to breathe again. The change is not sudden, not triumphant, but steady in the way a long, quiet room feels different the moment someone opens a window and lets air move through it once more. You walk along a road that leads toward a city gate, its wooden beams scarred by time, yet still sturdy, still holding the quiet authority of a place that has endured more than one generation's fear. Outside the walls, fields stretch in uneven patches, some well-tended, others still reclaiming themselves from neglect. But inside the gate, you sense a different kind of landscape, one shaped less by soil and more by intention. Cities, after the Great Dying, do not return as they were. They return changed. At first, the streets feel sparse, their stones remembering heavier traffic than they now carry. Yet as seasons pass, the spaces between people begin to fill again, not only with returning families, but with newcomers drawn by opportunity. Where land once defined survival, towns now offer something different: work that depends on skill, trade that depends on connection, and a future that feels, if not safer, at least more flexible. You move through a market street where shutters stand open, revealing goods arranged with careful pride, bolts of cloth, tools with polished edges, jars of preserved foods whose scents mingle into a warm, slightly sweet haze. The voices here are not loud, but they are purposeful, layered in negotiation, greeting, curiosity. It is the sound of exchange, and exchange has a way of knitting communities back together. You begin to sense that cities have become places where the new balance of the world is most visible. In the countryside, tradition still holds tightly, but here within walls, necessity has always encouraged adaptation. Guilds, those careful brotherhoods of craft and trade, have survived the plague's disruption and now find themselves in a position both fragile and unexpectedly influential. Inside a workshop, you watch a group of craftsmen working in patient coordination, each movement practiced, almost musical in its timing. The master does not simply command, he demonstrates, corrects, explains. Knowledge is passed hand to hand, tool to tool, in a chain that depends on continuity rather than hierarchy alone. Apprentices listen closely, not merely because they must, but because skill now promises something tangible: income, independence, perhaps even a respected place within the city's social fabric. It is a quiet shift, but a meaningful one. Skill, unlike title, can be learned. And what can be learned can also be improved. By midday, you wander toward a public square where notices are posted, their ink slightly smudged from curious fingers. Announcements of trade agreements, schedules for market days, regulations from city officials, all written reminders that urban life depends on shared information. Literacy here is still far from universal, yet the presence of written words in public space changes how authority is experienced. Rules are no longer only spoken, they are displayed. And what is displayed can be read, questioned, compared. You notice a young man tracing the letters with his finger, sounding them quietly under his breath, while an older relative watches with patient pride. The moment is small, almost tender, yet it hints at a broader transformation. Knowledge is beginning to move beyond monasteries and noble courts into the hands of ordinary townspeople. Information, once rare, is becoming slightly less so. That slightly matters more than it seems. You continue along a narrow street where a physician's sign hangs above a doorway, its symbol simple but recognizable. Medical understanding remains limited, shaped by older theories about balance within the body. Yet after the devastation of recent decades, there is a renewed urgency to observe symptoms, to record outcomes, to compare remedies. Experience, once dismissed if it contradicted tradition, now earns a cautious hearing. Survival has made people pragmatic. Pragmatism, in turn, opens the door to experimentation. In the late afternoon, you find yourself near a modest hall where city officials meet, their discussions measured, occasionally tense, yet grounded in negotiation rather than command. Urban governance has always required compromise, but now compromise carries greater weight because population loss has made every worker, every trader, every taxpayer more significant. Decisions must consider not only tradition but practicality, not only rank but contribution. Authority here feels less distant than in the countryside, still present, still respected, but closer. You begin to understand why cities often become the first places where new ideas take root. Proximity encourages comparison. Comparison invites reflection. Reflection leads, slowly, to change. You pass a small schoolroom where a handful of children repeat letters in a steady rhythm, their voices uneven yet earnest, while a teacher guides them with patient repetition. Education is not widespread, not yet, but its presence signals a growing belief that knowledge is not merely sacred, it is useful. Useful knowledge spreads. Even slowly, it spreads. As evening approaches, the city's atmosphere softens into a warmer hum. Workshops close their doors, taverns fill with low conversation, and somewhere, a musician tests a stringed instrument, its notes gentle and slightly hesitant before settling into a simple melody. life here does not feel carefree. Memory of loss still lingers, but it feels active, forward-leaning, as if the city itself is relearning how to exist. You sit near a fountain where water falls in a steady, calming pattern, and you notice how people gather not only to collect what they need, but to exchange news, opinions, small observations about trade routes, harvests, weather, rumors of distant places. Information moves person to person like a quiet current. And currents, once established, tend to widen. You realize that these revived cities are not merely economic centers, they are engines of perspective. Here, individuals encounter differences of accent, profession, belief, and difference encourages thought. Thought encourages questions. Questions once spoken aloud rarely disappear entirely. This is not a revolution of banners or speeches. It is a slow accumulation of conversations. As night deepens and lantern light reflects off damp stone, the streets grow quieter, yet the sense of motion remains, like a tide that continues even when unseen. The world that emerged from catastrophe is no longer frozen in survival. It is beginning, cautiously, to imagine possibilities. Cities breathe again. Guilds teach again. Children learn letters that will allow them to read rules, contracts, perhaps even ideas their grandparents never encountered. And within these ordinary developments lies something quietly profound. A society that has endured mass death is now investing, carefully but deliberately, in continuity. Skills that can be passed on, knowledge that can be preserved, systems that rely not only on inheritance but on participation. You look up at the narrow strip of night sky framed by rooftops and sense that this gradual rebuilding of urban life is not simply recovery. It is preparation. Preparation for a future that will ask more of human curiosity, more of cooperation, more of the ability to adapt when certainty falters. Because once a city learns to survive emptiness and then slowly fill again, it rarely forgets how fragile stability truly is. And that memory, carried quietly through workshops, classrooms, council rooms, and crowded market streets, becomes the soil in which new ways of thinking will continue to grow, steady, practical, and just mysterious enough that those living within it may not yet realize how different their world has already become. You begin to feel it, not as a moment, but as a long exhale. After seasons shaped by fear, after years when silence carried the weight of too many names no longer spoken, the world does not suddenly become bright or joyful in any loud, triumphant way. Instead, it softens. The sharp edges of survival begin very slowly to round into something gentler, as if time itself has decided to place a careful hand over old wounds and simply wait. You walk along a road that once echoed with the hollow stillness of abandonment, and now you notice how the ground bears the faint, steady imprint of returning footsteps. Not crowded, not hurried, but present. The kind of presence that suggests life has chosen, quietly, to continue. Fields stretch on either side, no longer entirely empty, though not yet full. Here and there, small patches of cultivation break the wild growth that had crept in during the worst years, and the sight carries a quiet reassurance. People are planting again, which means they are thinking about tomorrow. Planting is, after all, an act of faith disguised as routine. The air holds the mild scent of turned earth and distant wood smoke, and for the first time in a long while, neither smell feels like a warning. You pass a farmhouse where a window stands open just enough to let warmth escape into the cooling evening, and inside, you glimpse the simple choreography of ordinary life. Someone mending a tool, someone stirring a pot, someone setting aside bread for morning. These gestures are small, almost invisible in the grand sweep of history, yet they are the true markers of recovery. Empires may measure power in territory, but survival is measured in habits quietly restored. As you continue, you begin to sense that what has changed most is not only the structure of society, but the texture of how people move through their days. There is a steadier awareness now, a subtle humility shaped by memory. Those who lived through the great dying carry within them the knowledge that certainty can vanish without warning, and that knowledge, though heavy, has softened into something like patience. Patience with weather, patience with illness, patience with one another. You notice it in the way conversations pause more often, allowing space rather than rushing to fill silence, as though people have learned that not every quiet moment needs to be feared. By late afternoon, you find yourself approaching the edge of a town where the familiar signs of renewed life gather without ceremony. A market table stands with its modest offerings arranged carefully, not extravagantly, just enough. A pair of children trace patterns in dust with a stick, their laughter light but not careless. Nearby, a trader counts coins slowly, more attentive than proud, aware perhaps that prosperity can be as fragile as it is welcome. Nothing here feels extravagant, and yet nothing feels broken either. This is the strange balance that follows catastrophe, a world neither restored to innocence nor trapped in despair, but suspended in a quieter, more thoughtful middle ground. You step into a small chapel where evening light filters through narrow glass, painting soft colors across worn stone. The space is nearly empty, and the silence inside does not feel abandoned. It feels settled, like a room that has learned to hold both grief and gratitude without needing to choose between them. A single candle burns near the altar, its flame steady, unhurried, neither fighting the darkness nor surrendering to it. Faith, here, no longer sounds like certainty declared. It feels more like companionship accepted. You realize that after witnessing how fragile life can be, belief often shifts from demanding answers to offering presence. People still pray, still hope, still search for meaning, but many now do so with a gentler tone, as if understanding that mystery is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is simply the space where questions can rest. Outside, again, dusk settles across rooftops, and you hear the distant rhythm of a hammer from a workshop finishing its final task of the day. The sound is soft, almost comforting, a reminder that skill continues, that knowledge is being passed from one pair of hands to another. In small rooms lit by wavering lamps, scribes still copy texts, apprentices still practice careful movements, parents still teach children the words that will help them navigate a world both familiar and newly uncertain. Continuity, you begin to understand, is one of humanity's quietest forms of resilience. You walk toward a low hill overlooking the town, and from this gentle height, the scattered lights below resemble a constellation brought down to earth, each window a small declaration that someone inside has chosen warmth over darkness, presence over absence. No single light is impressive on its own, yet together they create a pattern that feels unmistakably alive. It occurs to you that history rarely changes through a single grand turning point. More often, it shifts through countless ordinary evenings like this one, where people cook, repair, read, pray, rest, unaware that their persistence is slowly reshaping the future. The world that emerged after the plague is not fearless. It is attentive. People listen more closely now, to the body, to the weather, to rumor, to reason. They negotiate where once they obeyed without question. They observe where once they assumed. They ask, sometimes quietly, and sometimes only to themselves, whether understanding might offer a steadier kind of safety than certainty ever did. And in that quiet habit of asking, something remarkable begins to take root. Not loudly enough to alarm tradition, not boldly enough to announce itself as a new age, but steadily enough that its influence will spread across generations. You look up as the first stars appear, patient and distant, and you sense how earlier centuries read them only as fixed symbols of destiny. Now, in scattered rooms across towns and monasteries, curious minds have begun to wonder whether those lights follow patterns that can be traced, whether the universe itself might be understood piece by careful piece. The thought is still fragile, but it is alive. Night deepens, and with it comes a calm that no longer feels like the uneasy hush that followed mass graves and shuttered homes. This calm is different, earned rather than imposed, shaped by people who have faced the worst and discovered that life, stubborn and ordinary, continues anyway. You feel the air cool against your skin and realize that the world has not returned to what it was before. It has become something else, not brighter in any dramatic sense, but clearer, as if the storm that once darkened everything has passed, leaving behind a landscape where every small light is easier to see. From ashes, not only literal, but emotional, social, spiritual, the glow that remains is softer, steadier, less dependent on illusion. The world has learned slowly how to breathe again, not with the careless ease of innocence, but with the measured rhythm of experience. Inhale shaped by memory, exhale guided by hope. Below you, the town settles into sleep. A final door closes. A last ember is banked for the night. Somewhere, a quiet prayer is spoken not in desperation, but in gratitude for another day that arrived without catastrophe. You understand then that the true aftermath of the great dying was not only loss, nor even recovery, but transformation. Subtle, patient, woven into daily life so gently that those living through it could not fully see its shape. Yet from this quieter world will grow new questions, new ideas, new ways of understanding both nature and authority, each one carrying the faint echo of a time when survival itself forced humanity to reconsider what it believed was unchangeable. And as you stand beneath the steady watch of the night sky, you sense that this long, quiet turning, this movement from ashes to a softer light, will continue far beyond this moment, carried forward by ordinary people who plant, write, trade, teach, and wonder, often without realizing that their calm persistence is what allows history, again and again, to begin anew. And so the night holds you gently, the past no longer a place of only sorrow, but a quiet companion, keeping watch as the world, scarred, wiser, and still hopeful, rests, breathes, and waits for morning.